Yes, I think all neighbors of Russia and also the countries that depend on Russia feel the impact of the war. And the world is such today that a conflict or a war in any remote part of the world impacts everyone, which is why we are seeing inflation, and that's another security challenge. Food security has been threatened. Shah Mahmood Miakhil, you've seen war from various vantage points. You've been a reporter, you've been part of various UN bodies, and then you were a policymaker in Afghanistan. In this day and age, what do you think drives countries to fight military conflicts? Why do you think conversations fail? And while I'm asking you a question, I also want to ask, since you've seen Afghanistan and the way Afghanistan has suffered the consequences of a war, do you think Ukraine is going down the same road?
Okay, thank you very much, and good morning to everyone, and also thank you for the invitation, and also I extend my condolences to the people of the UAE and the government by the death of their president, which has happened recently. Yes, in the last 50 years, which is a half a century, I have seen firsthand all kinds of war in Afghanistan. Occupation, intervention, civil war, proxy wars, war on terror, whatever you just call it. And everyone, including myself, my family, we are victims of this war. We lost our friends. So in conclusion, I can say is there is no good or bad war. There is no good and bad terrorist. War is war, and as Churchill was saying, jaw is better than war. You know? Always we have to prevent the wars. That is more important things. Once the war has happened, you violate all kinds of laws, human rights, and the average people, women and children, they will suffer. So the war in Afghanistan still has not ended. We are still in war. We don't know how this war will expand or will end. What will be the consequences of this war to the region and beyond the region? Because still, one thing's really bothered me. Most of the politicians or decision makers, their talks and walks are not the same. For example, in the case of Afghanistan, we were just fighting against terrorism, Al-Qaeda. But the leader of Al-Qaeda was in Pakistan. But the family of Al-Qaeda is living in Iran, the Bin Laden. So that was the reason, unless the governments of all nations, especially our neighbors in our region, if they support the non-state actors as a policy to destabilize other countries, I think the war will not end, because the war will change. From state to state war, which is already happening in Ukraine, we have seen it. But there is, the war which is non-state actors, which is, they are more dangerous to Afghanistan and also to the region. In order to prevent wars and solve the wars, when I say why we cannot end the war in Afghanistan soon, because still we don't have a space for dialogue. How to reshape the future of Afghanistan. The same group, Taliban, they will control, which they deprived the women, children, and others. They don't have a constitution. They don't believe on laws. They prevent education and everything. Or it will be expanded to the region also. So to prevent the wars in the future, we have to send our mindset. We have to, which is mentioned before, we have to have a sincere dialogues to create a mechanism for bring peace and stability. Invest in the peace process, especially invest in education, good governance, and poverty in others, because otherwise we will have another generation of extremism which will emerge. Because when I say 50 years in Afghanistan, I am the fourth generation. My father, myself, my children, my grandchildren, we are in this war. Because of the wrong policies in 80s, we are suffering now. If we make a wrong policies, forget or ignore the problem in Afghanistan, this will we have a pet in the next 10, 15 years. So that was the reason is we have to invest on the peace and also prevent the wars. Like nowadays, preventive medicine is better to curative, or restorative justice is better than punitive justice. So preventive war is more important than to have a peace, because when you destroy everything, then you just say, okay, let's have a peace. So yes, that is important to prevent the war. We have a saying, you cannot wash blood with blood. In the end, you should have a peace. Like you gave a good example from Japan. Yes, war has happened, but now you have a peace, you have a good relation. This should be a model for our neighbors, for the regions, and also to the world. Thank you.
Very well said. I'm afraid preventing wars does not suit the military-industrial complex, and so we have wars, and there's politics as well. But you spoke about people suffering the consequences of bad policy. And currently, Jane, I think the West, led by the US, would have the world believe that sanctions are the best policy to end a war or to check the expansionism of a particular country. But when America waged a war in countries like Afghanistan, for whatever reasons, they did not face any sanctions. They had, the United Nations, you talked about mechanisms for peace, has been incapacitated by the veto power that some countries get to exercise. The United Nations actively supported a state sponsor of terror like Pakistan. Do you believe that, that this has created an imbalance which is also triggering very violent reactions from some places like Russia? You said that it's not passive, but it's also probably the third law of Newton.
First, if you'll forgive me, I'd like to add my condolences to those of my colleagues for the loss of your president. And may I also say, I'm deeply humbled to be sitting here. I'm neither fluent in Japanese, nor Dari or Pashto, or Estonian, or Hindi, or any other language. And you humble me with your command, not only of English, but of the concepts that you deliver with a degree of humanity that I really admire. The United States is not responsible for the war in Ukraine. That's the punchline, I think, of your question. And I defy anyone who would argue that it is in any way. This is, as people have described it, naked aggression. But how do we prevent conflict? I mean, what's our theory of the case? Why are people killing each other under certain circumstances? What moves people to choose violence? I mean, people will riot, but they won't engage in a systematic campaign of violence unless they are led. So violent conflict, war, is a phenomenon of leadership. And do we see it coming? I mean, we live in an age when we know before victims do that they will be victims. We live in an age when we know before victims do that they will be victims. And what are we doing about it? Sanctions, you raised the issue of sanctions. They're an imperfect tool, everyone knows that. The sanctions that have been levied by 50 or 51 countries against Russia are unprecedented in their scale and scope. We also know that over 150 countries have not joined the sanctions regime. What are they designed to do? They are designed to send a very clear message. They are designed to inflict pain. And they really are designed to limit the capacity for war. If you want to prevent the outbreak of violence, that's one task. If you want to prevent the spread of violence or the continuation of violence, you need to create military and financial fire breaks to that violence, and sanctions in this case is in part designed to do that.
Marco, sanctions are also dictated by politics and the political exigencies of the countries that impose sanctions. So while we were discussing earlier that India has come under a fair bit of pressure for buying Russian oil, which is a very small fraction of what India buys. And Europe depends on Russian oil and is realizing the cost of this dependence. But do you think that sanctions also fail because there is a lot of hypocrisy and or inconsistency in the way they are deployed?
Of course, the world is imperfect, like also the peace can be imperfect, as I mentioned earlier. But what is left for us to do, if we don't want to go into total madness, meaning world war, as we have witnessed in the past, where millions and millions across the world perished. So we know what could happen if we won't do our global efforts to stop this, what's happening right now in Ukraine. Our parliament actually passed a resolution just a couple of weeks ago calling or naming this, what is happening there, as a genocide. We know that this is the case, has been in the past in different regions in the world, and that actually sometimes we have been, as a global actors, very reactive to this, allowing millions to be perished, exterminated. And in this regard, if our goal is to achieve peace which really means peace, not just another frozen conflict, another just imperfect solution where many people actually suffer after the peace is agreed upon, then sanctions is, perhaps the last resort we can go as countries who desire for peace. And I know how difficult it is among European nations today, for instance, to argue for not only importance of oil embargo, for instance, or gas embargo against Russian Federation. I know that even today, this moment we speak here in Dubai, the foreign ministers are in Brussels trying to conclude the deal on oil embargo. But eventually we end up there, because if we do want to end this conflict as soon as possible, we have to make sure that war machine, which gets money and resources for this kind of activity, must be punished.